Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Brief. I'm your host, Meredith Reed. Before you listen to this episode, you may want to listen to our episode with Amitabh Kumar from Social Media Matters and our episode with Katie Zigelman from Spectrum Labs if you'd like a little more background on caste discrimination and how Spectrum Labs is building AI technology for a model that is able to detect text-based caste discrimination online. So I'm here today with Beena Pallical, General Secretary at the NCDHR, the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, based in New Delhi. Today, Beena is going to give us a better understanding of where caste discrimination comes from and what it looks like in the real world, so we can have a better understanding of why it's so important to detect caste discrimination in the written conversations that people are having online. Welcome, Beena.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. So I was hoping you could start by giving us some background on the caste system. What is it and where does it come from?
So I think the caste system is a very unique system that probably started off in South Asia. So it's not really prevalent in India, but it's prevalent in the 5 countries of India and all the people who have moved away, the diaspora that have moved away from these 5 countries in South Asia. It's basically a system that was started based on different people are divided based on the jobs that they do. So, for example, the highest, the person on the topmost layer are the Brahmins, and they're the people who are actually become the priests of the temples. The second level is the Kshatriyas, or they're the ones who are in the army. They're the ones who are the protectors, and then you have the Vaishya, who are the businessmen. And below the Vaishya, you have Shudra, who are the people who are artisans, who sort of make, things with iron and stuff. But outside of the system lie a group of people who are the untouchables, formerly known as untouchables, who are called Dalits. That's a name that we as the community have adopted for ourselves. We are untouchable, meaning the 4 castes above us cannot touch us. So they will not eat with us. They will not, sit next to us. In earlier days, even if our shadows fell on them, they would actually go and wash themselves. They had to wash themselves to get rid of the whole idea of this caste system is then made part of the religion. So the Hindu religion has sanctioned the whole system, and many people believe it. Now, you might ask me, in today's age, who follows these systems, right? Who follows these systems of everything in India is based on caste. If you look at the ways the jobs are, if you look at who are the businessmen, if you look at who are the temple priests, they're all from one particular caste. Just to give you an example, if you take a random example of looking at how many people are heading corporations in this country who are from the Dalit community, it's very less. How many people are in the editorial board of media? It's almost 0 to nil. So we are saying that 25%, this is both Dalits as well as the indigenous population of the country. If you put both together, it's about 25% of 1.2 billion people. So that's a huge number. So by seeing the statistics, and if we look at that, the people from the Dalit community were not allowed to actually get an education. So we're almost 50 years behind a lot of other castes because we were not allowed to go to schools. We were not allowed. Even today, we have children who are from the Dalit caste cannot sit together or mingle together with other students. So that system is still continued, and it has been today, in today's modern age, maybe the forms of discrimination, the forms of untouchability have changed, but it's very much in the very core of Indian society. Not just Indian society, but people who've migrated to America, to other countries, take caste along with them, along with all the masalas and everything else that they take with them. They also take caste with them. I just like to say one more thing. The idea of purity and pollution, that all the jobs that nobody else wants to do, whether it's the cleaning jobs, whether it's going down the drains, whether it is your domestic help, all these jobs that are not considered clean by society are actually being done by the Dalits. And therefore, as they're considered dirty and pollutant, they're not even allowed to sit on the same table and have a meal with. Yes, definitely a lot of things have changed in the last few years, but the system still is very much prevalent in today's modern India.
So I'm interested in hearing more about your personal experience as growing up, being born as part of the Dalit caste. Could you tell us a little bit more about any sort of discrimination that you experienced growing up?
Yeah, it's quite strange because my parents hid the whole caste system from me and from my sibling as we were growing up. So we did not know we're from the Dalit community. Only several years later, the identity of religion was more important. My family comes from the Christian community. And so the idea, the religion was much more an identity that we carried. My parents enforced that identity. We grew up as Christians. But as years went by, I started questioning where I'm coming from. What is my caste? And only recently, about 10 or 12 years ago, when I actually, probably to be exact, about 10 years ago, I discovered who I am, that I'm from the Dalit community. And then went back and questioned my parents and asked them, why is it that you never told us that we were from this community? I think somewhere they were also trying to hide that identity, because probably that identity would be, at that time, they would have thought that was would have been more difficult for them to manage. So they hid that identity. But when I trace back of where I'm coming from, many stories that we were not told as children were told. Then my parents related to me, like how my grandparents were, not allowed to go into tea shop to drink tea because, they were from the Dalit community. But coming back to my experience as a Dalit, I remember going to, when I first moved to Delhi. Delhi is the capital city of India. When I moved to Delhi and I was looking out for apartments to rent, they wouldn't give apartments because when they knew that, I was from the Dalit community, it's very difficult for Dalits, especially if you declare upfront that you're from the community, it's difficult to get an apartment to rent. Many times many people ask me, how come you're speaking English so good? Because you're from the Dalit community. And so we have this picture in our mind that as Dalits, they should be uneducated, they should be cleaning, they should be, picking up garbage outside your house, but not actually sitting and probably having a conversation like this on the brief. So I think this itself, even them thinking that somebody from this community can actually speak English and can have a conversation is discriminatory. So I came to know my identity fairly late in my life, but several of my sisters who are also born like me as Dalits, but who are facing discrimination, specifically women, face much, much more greater marginalization as women because of their caste, because of their class, and because of their gender. Many times women are the ones who bear the brunt of the dominant caste and the skirmishes that the dominant caste have with the Dalit community, because it's the women who go to the well to draw water, it's the women who try and go out to the markets. So most of the times when you talk about violence, there's about 45,000 cases of violence registered by dominant caste on the Dalit community every year. That's 45,000. That's a huge number. Out of that, almost about 5,000 rapes. So things like rape, violence on Dalit women are used by the community, to settle scores, to ensure that they, to silence themselves. Many times there's backlash violence on many of these women. It's because if they, see, for a long time, we are not, as traditionally as Dalits, we never owned land. We never owned land because we were never allowed to own land. So the traditional occupation for many, other than doing the cleaning work, is also working as laborers on somebody else's land. But the moment that as a community, when there's an upward mobility, when communities decide that we don't want to work tomorrow as laborers, we want our children to get educated and, move ahead, that is when there is a backlash violence, that people say, hey, you're supposed to be working on my fields, not getting an education and moving on to have your own, entrepreneurships, or moving on to become teachers and doctors and engineers. And that is when there is so much of anger within the community. There is somebody called Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who has drafted the Constitution. And he was one of the first few members from the Dalit community who actually moved ahead and went to studied at Columbia University, and then went on to draft the Constitution. So even the Constitution is written by a Dalit person at a time when very few Dalits were even allowed to go to school. So there are several, good models, but I think when we look at the community in general, we can still see that the same patterns that existed 50 years ago are existing today in different forms.
Well, and that's a very interesting point that you touched on, because I did want to mention that in 1948, I saw that the Constitution banned caste discrimination, but of course, it seems that we're still seeing these behaviors. So what do you see as the main challenges to enforcement?
So I think that, I think one of the best constitutions we have in the world probably is the Constitution of India. There are several articles, there are several good laws. There's a law against untouchability. There's a law against caste system. There's a law against women who are engaged in manual scavenging. There's a whole lot of women who just go and clean toilets, and it's called manual scavenging, where they have something called dry toilets, where they just do their thing and they move away, and these women come with bare hands and clean. They're called manual scavenging. There's a huge number of manual scavenging still existing in this country, which is a shame to the country. Actually, it's a shameful practice, but women are still doing it, despite the fact that there is a law that prohibits employing manual scavenging, and there's a law that if you are caught, you'll have to, they will file a case against you if they know that you're employing women to do this, specifically from the Dalit community. But yet people are not worried. Yet people don't care when there are so many laws. I think the gap between the law, the Constitution, and the gap between the implementation, you said it right, is that gap is a huge gap, and it continues to grow. It should actually, the gap should become smaller. The reason why this is happening is that many of the people who are implementing these laws, who are implementing these policies, are actually people from the dominant caste. So they don't care. They don't care if, of course, I would feel really bad probably if I was implementing a policy and I knew that, my sisters or women from the Dalit community are doing this job. But I think somebody from the dominant caste don't really care. So one is definitely, most of the people in positions of power are, people from the dominant caste community, and therefore they do not think that it's relevant to ensure to implement these policies. So many people, including people on the streets, people, who are in government, people who are in corporations, are very casteist. They do not want to remove the system, because the system then questions the privilege that you have, the privilege that particular person has. In order to dismantle the system of caste, you have to question your privilege, where you're coming from, what you're getting, and people don't want to do that. People don't want to give up their privilege. And so for them so therefore they continue with this practice, because it's so much more easier. You just throw garbage on the street because some Dalit will come and clean up the streets. Whereas in Western countries, in other countries, people, clean up their own garbage, they pick up their own, they don't throw things on the road. But here it's okay because that some Dalit or some people from the indigenous community will come and clean. So I think the way to go forward is that the one thing that we look towards is justice. I think that is the key here, that if there are laws and they're not implemented, I think people should be taken to court. People should be booked under. That is what is not happening. Even with these 45,000 cases that are happening, there are very few cases that actually go on to court. And then, many times the perpetrators are left free, even if it's a case of gang rape, even if it is a case of really violent crimes. Many of these perpetrators coming from the dominant caste have money and power, and they use their money and power to ensure that they don't go to prison. So a lot of times people think that, hey, it's okay, because the law is on our side. And I think that is where is the difference, that the legal mechanisms have to work in sync with the people who are implementing the policies, so that we're able to bridge that gap.
And Beena, so much of what you just said, I have to be honest, doesn't sound so different from how things operate in the US. Yes, it's a different society in many ways, but I think it's important for our listeners in the US to realize that we're talking about caste discrimination and social structures in India, but a lot of the things you mentioned with money and power and people not being held accountable, and the way that we treat higher levels of society versus lower levels of society, giving them upward mobility and opportunities. There is a lot of what you mentioned that I think we can relate to here in the US as well. So
yes.
I was hoping that you could tell me a little bit more about the NCDHR, which again stands for the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. Could you tell me a little bit more about your organization?
Yes, sure. The National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights was initiated in about 20 years ago. Actually, we just celebrated 20 years the year before last year. So it was basically initiated to address physical violence, address access to justice issues, where at that time they were massacres. People would just go to villages, and because they had a difference of opinion with the Dalits, would just burn villages or just rape women or kill them. There were several incidences like this in the 80s, 90s, and suddenly we felt that in 98, there were many human rights activists who felt that we need to come together to create a national platform to actually visibilize these issues, to visibilize these crimes of violence. And so we started off with only the touch violence, where people were killed, murdered. And in 98, we initiated it just to bring in visibility and to ensure that the policymakers actually understand what is happening on the ground level. But eventually, after a few years, we realized that it is not only access to justice issues, it's not only physical violence, but it is also other aspects that we look at. For example, we can look at the economic rights, of Dalits, where there are budgetary provisions that are there in the budgets, in the federal as well as the state, but which does not go down to the communities. It's supposed to go for education, it's supposed to go for, housing, land, but really doesn't go. It's diverted, to build stadiums, it's diverted to build roads. So we realize that there are economic issues as well. We realized that during, when the tsunami struck, everybody was, worried about how many people died, But when we went to the ground, we realized that during tsunami, there were a lot of people who were not given relief and rehabilitation. And we were wondering, who are these people? When we actually did a further analysis, all the people who were left without relief and rehabilitation were people from the Dalit community. So if they had relief, quote unquote, at the end, if they had food at the end, they would give it to the Dalits. If they didn't have, the first preference would be given to the dominant caste. I myself have seen this in several state visits, where even 10 days after the floods or a cyclone, Dalits are still staying in situations that, I saw one family whose house was fully submerged after 10 days after the floods. They were not given relief. Yeah. So during humanitarian crisis, there is discrimination. Dalit women face further discrimination, both from the community because of patriarchy and because of her gender, but also from the larger society where she's seen as somebody. We have several cases where young women their lives are cut short, or they murdered or raped and murdered because they were on their way to school, or they were on their way to college. So Dalit women face triple marginalization. So I think when we realized that, then we had different units created within the campaign. So one unit looking at access to justice. We have another unit looking at Dalit women's rights. We have one unit looking at economic rights specifically, and within that looking at the humanitarian crisis. And also now we're very active in the COVID-19 situation, where we're looking at how we can provide relief, but not only relief, but how we can enable communities to access public entitlements.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how all of this, what your organization, the types of things that you address, how all of this extrapolates to online behaviors. Obviously, at Spectrum Labs, we're addressing caste discrimination in the online world. So I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about how we see caste discrimination manifesting online.
Yes. I think an online platform or any virtual platform is a reflection of society. Just like we have different people in society, and the politics of society is reflected in online platforms. For example, if you go on Twitter, one I would like to say is that this has really created a space for many people from the community to actually voice out their opinions, which otherwise we wouldn't have had, because many times mainstream media does not cover issues. So because of online platforms, many voices, whether they may not be great writers, but were able to voice out and protest against the inequalities that are there in the country, against violence that is happening. So definitely it's a really important platform for us. But within that, we need to understand that the same caste system is also reflected. The same groups who are offline are also online. So like if there are young women protesting something, immediately somebody will call out her caste name, like for example, they will call out which caste I'm from or which subcaste I'm from, and say, hey, you, and call out the caste name and say, if you don't stop, we will rape you. This might be happening to other women as well, but they further add the caste angle to it. We have affirmative action in this country. Many of the Dalits and indigenous population are able to get, quota, get jobs, get through education, through these affirmative action policies. So many times they say, oh, you've just come here through affirmative action, so why are you here? You don't have brains. This is what you're. Many times I've seen these conversations online. So I think, and it's very easy to abuse online because you don't know who that person is. She's behind some computer, some name may not even be the correct name, and being abusive to that person. And many times it may not even look like abuse to a common person, because if you're using just the caste name and calling somebody will say, oh, that's just a caste name, there's no big deal. But you're using that as a derogatory, as a derogatory term to actually put us down. Just like in the US, some terms that you used to use for African Americans no longer are used today, right? Similarly, these terms are also not meant to be used, but they use that. And it's very difficult. I've been working with Twitter India to see how we can look at these terms and how the systems, somewhere in the US, somewhere in any part of the world can actually address sitting, whoever is looking at that system to look at what is the abuse, how do we identify that? It's a very thin line, between. But I also would like to say that despite all this anger, despite all this online abuse that is happening, calling you by caste name, and if you're a Dalit woman, further, accusing you and threats of rape, we still see that it is an important platform for us as a community to access, whether it be Twitter, whether it be Facebook, because it is giving us sort of not a level playing field, but a field to play on, I would say.
Beena, I really feel like I could talk to you about this for at least an hour more. You have shared so much incredible information and really given us important context on caste discrimination. I do want to ask you one more question before we go. What would you say to people who say that the conversations they have online that involve discriminatory language, that it's just words, it doesn't mean anything? What is the impact of words that people say online? Why does this matter?
Yeah, I think that, if I know that some women from the community get abused because of the color, saying that, hey, you're a black, and then use other abusive words to use that. And we forget that on the other end, there is actually a woman who's sitting and doing, sending out that tweet, or it's a human face. There's a human face at the other end. And I think sometimes we do forget that. We forget that, many times. And we also forget that the community is able to do this because for us, this is a very empowering platform, to be able to go out and voice our opinion, which we were not allowed earlier because the media mainstream media doesn't represent us. So for us, this space is important. And imagine many people, younger people, are taking their courage and actually going out onto online platforms and addressing issues. But when they face backlash like this, it may not matter to the person who's actually doing it, but the other person who's, has taken a lot of courage to come on Twitter or come on Facebook or come on some online platform to express his or her anxieties and to express their thoughts and opinions are attacked in this way, would actually really sometimes even break people. I know people who have gone off these platforms because they couldn't take the kind of abuse. So I think it does matter. It emotionally drains one person, and it's the same. Words can be extremely violent. You don't have to hit somebody to be violent. I think words itself is so violent, it can violate somebody's human rights, I feel.
Beena, thank you so much for being here and giving us such incredible insight on caste discrimination. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Meredith. All the best.
And we'll see you next time on The Brief.